this working? Yeah. Okay. Welcome everybody to today's Colloquium. Okay. We'd like to welcome Dr. Joel Weinberger. Dr. Weinberger is professor of psychology at the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies at Adelphi University. Prior to his position there, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship in human motivation at Harvard University. He's the author or co-author of approximately 100 published articles and chapters, and he's the editor of 2 books. His interests include unconscious processes, personality, motivation, and effective components of psychotherapy. His work has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, and he was awarded the Ulf Brage Award from the University of Lund in Sweden for his work on unconscious processes. He is a founding member of Implicit Strategies, an organization that assesses implicit processes. Dr. Weinberger is also a practicing clinical psychologist. Please welcome Dr. Weinberger.
I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this and look back at you, so let me work that out. What you might see me do is that, so you'll have to put up with that. Thank you for having me, Mark. Thanks for your nice introduction. What I want to talk about today, you see the title, it's called The Normative Unconscious and Psychotherapy. I'm going to talk about, Mark mentioned that I do a lot of work in unconscious processes. I'm a clinical psychologist, and we deal a lot with unconscious processes. So I'm going to talk about a type of set of unconscious processes and try and describe them to you. And there are a lot of different kinds of unconscious processes. There are a lot of different ways of differentiating them from one another. There's not just a monolithic, this is unconscious, this is not unconscious. Freud tried that early on, didn't work. Other people have tried it, doesn't work. The first kind of unconscious is the one that I'm guessing this is mostly a clinical audience. Am I right about that? Okay. So there's the unconscious that clinicians are usually familiar with and work with, and that focuses on unconscious processes that lie behind psychopathology, that lie behind maladaptive behaviors. It's the kind of unconscious that messes you up. And then you see a patient and you find out that something unconscious is driving their maladaptive behavior, and clinicians tend to focus on that kind of stuff. If they're psychodynamic clinicians, they're going to focus on defenses, which are unconscious for the most part, wishes, conflicts, and so on. If you're a CBT, you're going to focus on things like self-evaluations that are negative. You're going to focus on automatic thoughts. I presume you're all familiar with what I'm talking about. I don't have to go into detail about that. Okay, now there's another group of unconscious processes. I'm simplifying it, but I think I'm going to try and make the point. These unconscious processes are studied by the empirical scientists of our field, mostly social psychologists and cognitive scientists, and they see unconscious processes very differently from the way clinicians do. And in the last 25 years or so, there's been a figurative explosion of research. There are now hundreds and hundreds of papers on these kinds of unconscious processes in the cognitive and social psychological literature. They are not focused on psychopathology. They're not focused on maladaptive behavior. They're looking at how we function as human beings normatively and the place of unconscious processes in that function. And as it turns out, unconscious processes play more than a minor role and even more than a major role. They play the predominant role in normative everyday functioning. Just to show you how they don't like to talk about clinical stuff, they don't even like the word unconscious. They tend to use the word implicit. They think it's more descriptive, it's less connected to the associations of the clinical unconscious. Let me tell, can you all hear me, by the way? I have such a loud voice, I thought maybe I ought not to use a microphone and just blow you out of the room or something. This is a true story happened to my colleagues and me with this terminology. I'm partly responsible for the term implicit, I'm sorry to say. What happened was we submitted a paper to a journal in psychology. It's called Psychological Review. Have you heard of it? Okay. So we sent in a version and we talked about unconscious motivation in this paper. and we got back this scathing, horrible review. We should all die, and we're not going to go to heaven, and maybe we should find another line of work before we die. So I was devastated. I was a postdoc at the time. So I showed this review to my then mentor, David McClelland. I don't know if many of you know who he was. He looks at it and goes, all right, listen, go to the word checker and change the word unconscious to implicit, and change the word conscious to self-attributed. He didn't use explicit. I said, why are we doing that? He said, don't worry about it. He had a bit more experience than I did. So we sent in virtually the same paper. We took some of the criticisms that seemed reasonable to us, but it's the same paper basically. It says implicit instead of unconscious. It says self-attributed, which has since become explicit, instead of conscious. We send it back out, and I'm thinking, okay. And it comes back, tour de force, brilliant paper, going to put it in the psych review. Thank you for your innovative and groundbreaking work. And I looked, I said, what'd you do? And he said, I know these guys. And what he knew is what I'm telling you. You use the word unconscious in that company, and they think you're a Freudian. Freud is bad, therefore you're bad, it's over for you. I'm going to use the word unconscious anyway. Occasionally I'll slip into implicit and explicit when I talk about their work. Okay. How do they communicate with each other? They don't. Clinical psychologists, clinicians generally, do not communicate with social psychologists and cognitive scientists. Raise your hand if you hang out and talk with cognitive psychologists and social psychologists. There's 3 aberrant people in this room. Okay. It doesn't happen. I'm one of the aberrant people as well, I should say. On the other side of the coin, social psychologists and cognitive scientists do not communicate with clinicians. They just don't get together. If they're in the same room, they occupy different corners of it. Or for the most part, they're not in the same room. I tend to go to some of these conferences. I'm kind of the strange guy. I'm probably a strange guy anyway. But in any case, I'm the strange guy in the conference. They come and they whisper to me. I tell them some clinical stuff. They say, you don't really believe that, right? You're joking. So that's the nature of that. And the result is that instead of having a nice, three-dimensional, comprehensive understanding of unconscious processes, instead of social psychologists having the benefit of literally decades of experience, clinical experience, empirical experience with the unconscious processes that clinicians know on a daily basis, and instead of clinical people having an understanding of this 25 years worth of research that's going on, they don't talk. They don't know it. And so it's unfortunate, because now we do not have a comprehensive view of unconscious processes. And I think it's there. I think there's the clinical side. They're not mutually exclusive. I think they're complementary. They're synergistic, if you know them. But we don't talk to each other. Okay. What do I want to do today with that background? Given that I expected a clinical audience, I'm going to talk about the non-clinical unconscious, if you will, and introduce you to a little bit of it in, I hope, language that will be friendly to people who are more immersed in clinical work. I'm going to try and give, in the time I have, not a lot, but a couple of ways they can be applied, why they might be useful as opposed to just academically interesting. And it's my hope that this will result in clinical people, I'll explain what I mean, understanding this work, maybe using it to benefit their clinical work, which I think will help clinicians work with their patients and understand a little more of what's going on. Were I talking to a social psychology audience or cognitive audience, I would be coming at it from the other point of view. Let me tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to go into detail at all, and I may not even mention a lot of the research. I do some of it, I'm familiar with it, but I thought what I would do instead is just tell you what these processes are like. You can take it on faith that they're empirically supported. If you want to question me about it, I can talk to you. I have a paper in a chapter in a social psychology book on these processes. I have a paper coming out in a psychoanalytic journal about these processes. I'm writing another paper for a more general clinical audience, more of an overview. And I'm told that I'm supposed to sign a book contract soon where I'm going to write about it in more detail. So I've got the research to back it up. But I thought what I would do is just talk about overall what these things are like. Okay. So here are some core principles of these kinds of implicit, unconscious, normative processes. Can you read that? Yes, no? Okay. I think a good way, I don't know if it's the best way, but it works for me and it seems to work for other audiences, is instead of just saying, here's how implicit processes work, to contrast them with explicit conscious processes, because we're more familiar in our day-to-day thinking with consciousness and explicit. So I'm going to move them back and forth, so to speak. And explicit processes, just to define them, are things that you can be aware of, that you can be conscious of, whereas implicit processes are things that are going on in your head that you're not aware of. They're literally, descriptively unconscious. Am I making sense so far? Okay. One important factor behind implicit processes is they start earlier in life. They develop practically from birth. They develop before explicit processes, which means that your earliest experiences are coded implicitly, but not explicitly. Okay? And that's because the brain structures that underlie the neocortex and the cortex and so on, without getting into specific structures, develop later. You're born with the implicit structures, they're pretty much there, and then the explicit structures develop over time. You see that in babies, right? Babies don't know what's going on, and they get to be 3 and 4, they start to be able to talk, they start to be able to tell you things. There's brain development. So my point is that experiences that occur in the first 3 or 4 years of your life are mostly coded, mostly processed implicitly, because, one, you don't have language, and two, because the brain structures haven't developed yet. Contrary to certain clinical points of view that you know them, you don't like them, you push them out, you repress them, they're defensively, the classical Freudian view is what? You had an Oedipus complex, you said, I can't handle this, make it go away, and now you have childhood amnesia. That's not the case. What is the case is, I don't know that anyone believes that anymore, but in case some do. What is the case is, we're not talking about repression. We're not talking about something that was there that we pushed out of our heads. We're talking about something that was never processed consciously and explicitly. It was only processed implicitly, unconsciously. That doesn't mean that once the explicit processes develop and come to maturity, 3, 4, and later, that implicit processes now take a back seat. They're just as important and just as powerful throughout life. What you have instead is 2 parallel sets of processes operating. You have the implicit processes as strong as they ever were, but you have another adaptive way of dealing with the environment, the explicit processes working in parallel. And I stress the word parallel. They often do not interact. You've got one set of processes here, one set of processes here, and you're operating on 2 levels at least. I'm simplifying it, it's more than 2 levels, but I'm making a point. Yes? Okay. And the next and final point, which I think is very important about implicit processes, is they're not motivated. They just are. It's how you deal with the world. They're not a result of defense. I'm not saying there's no such thing as defense. That's not my point here. But today I'm talking about these in particular. They're not a result of conflict. They're not a result of I don't want to know. They are just the way human beings operate. Okay. So here's, I call it the normative, excuse me, the normative unconscious, because it's normal, and that's what I called it in my last paper, so I have to stick to it now. I'm going to define 3 different kinds of unconscious processes that I'm calling normative. I'm going to discuss them very quickly. I'll give a clinical implication or application, and they are the 3: implicit memory and implicit learning. Those are actually 2. I'm choosing to treat them as one because really conceptually they are one. You can't have a memory without having learned something, and you can't learn something without having a memory. I'll explain in a minute why they tend to be separated in literature. But I'm going to treat them as a combination, as one set of processes. Affective primacy, which I'll define in a few minutes as well, which basically says that we're emotional beings before we're anything else, and we organize things emotionally rather than any other way. And automaticity, which is, I guess, a fancy word for habit. We tend to do things without thinking about it. But these things have rules, and that's what I want to talk about. Okay. So let's start with implicit memory. Again, I'm going to do it by contrasting it to explicit memory, because intuitively, it doesn't make sense. How can I have a memory I'm unconscious of? Then I don't remember. Well, explicit memory is the kind of memory most of us are most familiar with. You remember what your address is, you remember something you did today. I say, remember when we met a year ago? And you might say, no, I really don't. Or, yes, I do, and you were doing X, Y, and Z. That's explicit memory. It's recall, it's recognition. It's what most of us are referring to when we talk about memory. Implicit memory is something that operates unconsciously, as I said. And you can't ask someone, because you can't say to somebody, why don't you tell me what you're unconsciously remembering? Before you laugh too much, I'm going to digress and tell, this is a true story. I was at another colloquium, it wasn't me speaking. It was a very distinguished person in psychology, I won't mention his name, Charlie Spielberger. And he's a creator of many self-report measures, and a good one. Very good methodologist, very good researcher. He was president of APA, and he's talking about his anxiety measure and his anger measure. And then he says, you know, I tried for years to create a measure, a self-report measure of repression, and I was never able to do it. And I'm sitting there, as probably many of you are sitting there, going, what would you ask? I forgot. I don't know. What happened in your childhood? I don't know. Aha, repression. And he, in all seriousness, is telling us, I just couldn't make such a measure. Well, I think you can't. So what you do instead is you see that an experience altered the way someone behaves, and that demonstrates that they have a memory of it. Because they behave differently before and after the experience. The experience has long-term effects, short-term effects. Turns out it often has long-term effects. And the way we often look at this, and this is one of the differences between implicit memory and implicit learning historically, is a lot of the research on implicit memory is research with brain damage. So you get people with amnesia, right? How many of you have heard of HM? Case HM, you know what I'm talking about? Not all of you know. Okay. This is a guy who had epilepsy and had like half his brain taken out, including memory structures. I don't remember offhand what they were, probably a hypothalamus and a couple of other structures. And now he has no more epilepsy, except he doesn't remember that he has no more epilepsy because he doesn't remember anything. Okay, so Milner worked with him for decades, and every day she'd come in and reintroduce herself to him, and he'd say, nice to meet you, and she'd leave, and she'd come in the next day, and she'd introduce herself. That was the level of the lack, and there are other cases like this. I'll mention one more. And so on, apparently he has no memory whatsoever. However, when he was taught things, he was able to do them the next day or the next week or even months later. So he had a memory. But if you asked him, he said, I don't know what you're talking about. So they would teach him like how to type. I don't remember if typing was one of them. I think there was a computer skill they taught him, and he learned it. Then they come in the next day and they go, hey, why don't you work on the computer? And he goes, I've never seen a computer. What are you talking about? And they'd say, well, give it a shot. He goes, all right, but I don't know. And it would work. He'd be able to do it. There's a great story by Dan Schachter. He's probably the most prominent memory researcher in the country, if not in the world. He's at Harvard. And he played a game of golf with somebody like this, who claimed he didn't know how to play golf, picked all the right, and had played golf before his dementia set in, picked all the right clubs, got a score, the game was over, and he didn't remember that he had played golf. The classic story, and I'll stop with this one, is a guy named Claparède, who was a French physician right around the turn of the century. And what he did was there was a woman in the clinic that he worked at suffering from Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome is usually a result of severe alcoholism, damages your brain, your memory goes, there's a vitamin B deficiency, blah, blah, blah. In any case, she can't remember. So he goes to shake her hand, he puts a pin in his hand. Nice guy, Papa, right? He shakes her hand, she gets stabbed, she goes, wow, what the, who are you? Why did you do this to me? And he goes, see. He leaves, comes back the next day, she has no idea who he is. He goes, nice to meet you. And she says, not shaking your hand. He goes, well, why not? She goes, I don't know, I'm just not doing it. She had no memory of being stabbed, but she had an implicit memory of being stabbed. So that's how you define it. The first day she's shaking his hand, no problem. The second day she's scared of him, and she's not going to shake his hand. Am I making sense? Little Albert is a similar story, what they expected to happen to little Albert, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So, as I said, the memory is implicit in the behavior. Let me move on. Okay, let's talk about implicit learning. Now, the reason I'm putting them together is they really are two sides of the same coin. You cannot, put it up. You can't learn something if you don't remember it, right? It has to be in your head. You have to know that you experienced it. By the same token, you can't remember something you haven't learned. So they really are the same. They're separated for the reasons I described, the literature. In the case of implicit learning, the literature tends to be more normative. The literature tends to be things that you teach people who are not brain damaged. The easiest thing to think about is language. You have, all of you in this room have implicitly learned how to speak a language, presumably English since you're here, perhaps some other language. I always say, I'm amazed at the intelligence of French children. By age 2, they can speak French. And I can't speak a word of it. It's amazing. They're all geniuses. Now, in addition to the fact that kids don't say, give me the rules of grammar, let me study them. I don't know how many of you had to take Spanish in high school or something and were tortured with, these are how you conjugate verbs, and you don't do that with kids. Now, that's largely genetic. Chomsky showed that. But to show you how it's implicit, if I say, this be a good sentence, you know that's wrong. Now tell me why. Why is it wrong? You don't know the rules of grammar and syntax. I'm sorry, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
No, you're right.
But it sounds wrong, right? And when I speak a sentence correctly, it will sound right to you. When I speak a sentence incorrectly, it will sound wrong to you. Maybe when you were in high school, you were tortured like I was with diagramming sentences, and it came like this, and this, and this, and this. And I had to learn this is an adverb, which has something to do with a verb because it adds to it, I don't know. But we have, in fact, learned language implicitly, right? And that's, by the way, why learning Spanish in high school by putting on headphones and learning to conjugate verbs doesn't work, because it's not how we learn things like language. Okay, now, not everything is time limited, like learning a language. We are implicitly learning things all the time. I mentioned that already, so let me move on. Okay. What implicit learning is you pick up a relationship between two experiences. I use the word stimuli because they use the word stimuli, but, or stimul, apparently. Two stimuli. You learn a relationship between two stimuli without intention, without knowing that you're doing so, and without being able to say what you've learned. Okay? What is it you learn? I'll give a couple of examples. It's learning that you get without awareness, but yet it affects your behavior. Now, this is what's important. What you learn in implicit learning, the rules are you pick up what co-varies in the environment. What do I mean by that? Whatever goes together, whether they go together, they ought to go together or not, you learn it anyway. One thing follows another, you have implicitly learned it. If it's nonsense, you implicitly learn it anyway. If it's, most of the time, it wouldn't be built into us if it didn't have a positive effect most of the time. But not always. So, for example, I'll give you the standard study, and then I'll give you a more entertaining one. A guy named Reber, who studies something called artificial grammar, he gives a bunch of sentences, not sentences, word strings, excuse me, that follow certain rules. But he doesn't tell you what the rules are. And he just gives you one after the other, and you look at him and you're going like, why is this crazy man doing this to me? This makes no sense. Now he's done, and he says, now I have a bunch of other word strings, I want you to tell me which ones fit with the first set. And you're thinking, I don't even understand what you did. How are they going to fit? And yet, at a much greater level than chance, you can pick the ones that follow the rules. There's some kind of stochastic, statistical set of rules, and you can do it. But if you try and figure out what the rules are, you can't do it. Or you do it much worse. You do it by looking at it the same way we just did sentences. I'd be talking to you, and you go, that looks right. No, that doesn't look right. The second one that's more entertaining shows the arbitrary nature of it. A guy named Lewicki, Paweł Lewicki, he's a Polish psychologist, wrote a whole book on studies that he did, just so many that they're like labeled 2AB and 3BC or something like that. So there's like 8 million studies, so let me think of one that's fun. Okay, so he's got a study where he shows people pictures, photos, and in one photo, someone's holding a book. It's not blatant, they're not saying book, they're just carrying a book. And in another photo, they're not. There's people, similar looking people not carrying a book, okay? Underneath these photos are either threats or benign statements. That's it, just book, threat, no book, benign. He then is done, and he shows them pictures of people and says, tell me what you think of these people. And in some pictures they're carrying a book, and in some pictures they're not. They're carrying a book, I don't trust this guy. Now, I don't think most of us think of books as weapons and dangerous. This is a covariation, exactly what I'm talking about. It's just, he made it happen, and it happened on the spot in the lab. Think about life. This is happening to us all the time. We're always picking up these covariations, and they become truth to us. And they become unquestioned truths because we don't know that we did it. So they become powerful. So it doesn't matter whether these successive experiences make logical sense, are rational, really reflect the functioning of the world or not. Covariation is what matters. So you have an amotivational, alogical type of process. Am I making sense? As a clinical person, you can see now all kinds of crazy stuff and beliefs that your patients can bring to you without thinking about it, without even knowing that they have it. Okay. I said that already. Oh, I wanted to make one more point. It is literally empirical. The word empirical means experience. We tend to use it to say science. Empirical equals science. But what it really means is experience. These processes are literally empirical. They are based entirely on idiosyncratic experience. They reflect your experience. If you can understand them, you'll know what your patient's experiences were like. I hope I'm still making sense. Okay. All right. Clinical implications. Based on what I just said, your patient comes in, has all kinds of rational, sensible beliefs about the world, because most of the time this works, but has some beliefs that are wildly off, and has some beliefs that blatantly contradict what they say they believe. And let me give you an example of the latter, because we see it every day. Sexism and racism, okay? There's not a person in this room who's sexist or racist, I'm sure. If I gave you a measure, you'd all come out great. Now, what ends up happening? You're walking down, you're at your door, you're about to go in, and a young African-American is walking down the street, you get in the house faster, you lock the door. You don't think to yourself why you did it. You come up with a rationalization, but people do it. Well, then they're not egalitarian, right? But if you ask them, they are, and they would deny it. I once heard a comedian, African-American comedian, I'm not going to be as good as him, I don't have his timing, but I'll tell the joke anyway. He talked about exactly the phenomenon that I'm describing, that he'd walk by people in cars and they'd lock the car door and so on. Then he said he's on a highway going 65 miles an hour on a highway, zipping by, and he'd zip by someone on the highway, locks the door. Okay? He says, what am I going to do? Dive out of my car at 65 miles an hour, grab onto their door, force it open, mug them, dive back to my car because I timed it perfectly, and I've done it. Now, I'm willing to bet this actually happened. And he made comedy of it. This explains it. Am I making sense? Okay. Next. If things co-vary, the depending on your background, depending on your experiences, depending on your history in a maladaptive way, that's what you're going to learn. Not because you're defending against some impulse, not because you have some secret talk that goes on in your head that you use, not because of conflict, because that's how the process works. It's normal. It just so happens that we have a much more complicated environment than the environment this was developed for. It's developed in evolution, in an evolutionary sense, to work on a savanna. Well, most of us don't live on a savanna. I don't, wouldn't prefer it. And it doesn't work as well, but it hasn't been selected out. It's still there. Okay. This helps to explain. Again, I'm talking about these processes. I don't want you to think I don't believe in defenses or conflicts. But since I'm focusing on these, this helps to explain some of the neurotic connections our patients seem to have when they come in, and then tell you they don't have. I want a happy life. I want my relationships to be good. And that's why I've been married 4 times to alcoholics. You know, they're oblivious to it. They are unable to change it. They go, this guy's different. He's a caring person. He hit you. He had a bad day. You all know what I'm talking about. You've dealt with these people. And we are these people. They're not resisting knowing something necessarily. They're not engaged in some superego conflict. It's not because of a negative self-image, except indirectly. They really don't know. They're just behaving in accord with the covariations in their environment. Am I still making sense? Tell my wife, please. Okay. Now, you're going to have a problem, especially because the most complicated thing in anybody's life are your relationships. And if you're going to implicitly learn what relationships are like early on in life, and you will then apply them to later relationships. If that was a healthy thing, a reality-based thing, an adaptive thing that you learn, great. But as often as not, it isn't. And now you are misapplying what you've learned about relationships to current relationships. So I'm sitting in the office, a patient comes to me and says, you know, you're looking to exploit me. Thinking, other than taking your money, I don't think so. Sometimes we call that transference, sometimes we refer to object representations in relationships. What I'm saying is they remember and they learn. And what else do you expect them to apply? It's what they have in their head. It's what they've picked up. These are the covariations. So you are especially likely to see these because they are especially important and because they're especially complex. Yes? No? Okay. What does a therapist often do? Tries to make the unconscious conscious, which is, hey, you seem to be behaving in this way as though you believe this. It's not because they really believe it and they don't want to believe it and they're defending against it. It's not because the automatic thoughts make them like that necessarily. So what do? We make transference interpretations, we uncover automatic thoughts, we engage in Socratic dialogue. I love that term, Socratic dialogue. I'm waiting to teach someone Pythagorean's theorem in Socratic dialogue. If you've read Socrates, that's the big example. And never would have worked with me. He just happened to find a really smart street kid. But anyway, it's not resistance necessarily, it's not defenses, it's not making them come to a conclusion that they already knew. It's working in 2 parallel processes. You're getting the implicit process to come to awareness, and now it'll be encoded explicitly. So you haven't moved it, or you have moved it in a sense. It's still there, it's still implicit, but now it's also explicit. Sometimes we call that insight. And what I'm calling insight now is simply, it's now in the explicit part of your head, as well as in the implicit part of your head. That doesn't make it go away, especially when you read psychoanalytic case studies. Someone has an insight, the Red Sea parts, they go, oh, and cures, they never go, that person stayed in therapy 3 years later and still has the same problem, which, by the way, happens all the time. Okay. So what you're doing, I think, is making your patients aware of implicitly learned phenomena, assumptions that they have about the world, and once they do that, they're in a position to make more adaptive kinds of assumptions about the world, at least at the explicit level. I'm not talking now, you haven't changed the implicit, it's still there. And we're all frustrated when we work with patients, right? The patient goes, oh, I understand now, and so I'll just continue doing it anyway. But at least I understand. This is especially frustrating for me. I have a lot of psychoanalytic friends, I know why I do this, so stop. I don't care that you know why you do it. Don't do it anymore. But they do, and I'm arguing that this is why. Okay. But it is a step. It's not an unimportant step. Am I okay. So I'm going to move on to the next thing. If someone wants to ask a question about these two, I can take it. Yes?
So, can I get to this a bit? Why?
You'll have to speak louder. I'm old and deaf.
It seems like there's like negative experiences or maladaptive ones are prioritized. Otherwise,
No. I'm not saying that. I'm saying when you treat people in therapy, they don't come in and say, boy, have I implicitly learned great things. Let me tell you about them, how well my life is going. Because it works a lot of the time. I would argue it works most of the time. But if you happen to have had covariate experiences and memories that are maladaptive, and the people we see, for the most part, have had those, or they wouldn't be coming in. That's what we see. But they also have stuff that they know how to do. They have relationships that work, right? They have jobs that they can be good at. They know how to order in a restaurant. They don't get up in the middle of the restaurant and ask someone to do their homework for them. You know what I'm saying?
Right, but is there some sort of selection, like stress, or because
No, the point of this is it's entirely empirical. Whatever you happen to have experienced, that's what you learn. If it's good stuff, God bless you, you had better parents than 99% of the people on the planet. And if it's, it reminds me, I won't tell that joke. Okay. And if it's bad stuff, then that's what you've internalized in an unconscious way. And most of us have bad stuff as well as good stuff. But patients don't come in and say, I'm here because I have a great life and I wanted to share it with you. They come in because the quality of their life is not what they wish it to be. At least I haven't had this patient. Perhaps some of you have had a patient who wants to share their happiness with you. I have had patients who told me that their childhoods were ideal. And you know what happens after a while with the ideal childhood. But okay. Anybody else before I move on to the next topic? Okay. Affective primacy. The point here is that the most salient experience out there in the field, out in the world, is emotional experience. That's what we notice the most. That's what we focus the most on. Addressing what you said, but good stuff can happen too. Literally, our brain is centrally affective. The midbrain, on top of it are the cognitive structures. They come later, they develop later, and our minds are that way too. We function that way. It makes evolutionary sense because now you're on the savannah and you see something moving in the tall grass. You can either leave, have a fear reaction, or you can say, spots, tail, whiskers, leopard, and now you're launched. Instead, you hit the road because you have an immediate emotional response, and as you're running, and William James talked about this, you say, I'm running away, from a leopard, and now you get to live. It works for positive too. You see something that you would like to eat. You can't go, yeah, looks like a deer, probably a deer. Deer's gone. You got to move. So it makes sense that the most important thing in our field, phenomenologically, I don't know which word I should use, they're both good, is something that has an emotional effect on you, okay? And it's stronger when you don't know. So when you see a patient, I had a patient, I don't have this person anymore, did this. I said, you seem angry. No, not angry. I'm more worried about that patient than I am about the one, you pissed me off. Not because I think the patient is going to slug me, but because they're not connected to this emotion, right? We've all had this clinical experience. Okay. So, let's see, do I want to say something else? Probably. Okay, so the term refers to the fact that emotion is primary, but it also refers to the fact that our experiences are organized emotionally. We like to think our experiences are organized rationally, conceptually, sensibly. In technical terms, that's horse manure. They are organized centrally emotionally, and here are some people, there are others who say it, but I like the way they say it. We group things together that elicit the same emotion. So, for example, we might group together song and moon because they make us happy, as opposed to song and rhyme. Am I making sense? This is what happens unconsciously. Consciously, we can pull out, we can make conceptual connections, but unconsciously, we organize experiences affectively, and not objectively and not perceptually. Let me give you a study or two that shows that just quickly. There was a study by Murphy and Zients in the mid-90s, and they subliminally showed angry or happy drawings of men and women. Okay. And they say, what'd you see? I didn't see anything. Okay. Now I'm going to show you something else, and I want you to tell me which one most closely matches what you just saw. I didn't see anything. Well, guess. Okay. So, men and women, angry, smiling. Got it? Okay. When they showed an angry, or when they showed an emotionally matched face, they got it. Now, these are statistics, but I'm going to say they got it. So greater than chance. When they showed a gender-matched face, they didn't get it. So unconsciously, what they processed most was the affect, not the gender. And think about it. What's the first thing you see and the first thing you use to describe another person? You say she, he, woman, man. But in fact, unconsciously, the first thing you're processing is their emotional reaction. And that's what that study shows. And there are a million other studies that show something similar. So what I'm telling you, and if you look in the brain, which you don't have to look in the brain, take my word. Do you know who Ledoux is? Okay. Ledoux and Phelps, now at NYU, actually showed that the emotional connection is quicker. They call it the low road than the cognitive connection. You get an emotional reaction, and you organize around it. That's what happens. All right. So, clinical implications. Kernberg, you all know Otto, right? He's a good friend? Okay. He talks about splitting. That's a big thing associated with Kernberg's theory. I like Kernberg's theory. They split their experience Bassi on affect. Okay. He says that there's such a thing as splitting, and other than Bassi, you organize your experiences into good and bad sometimes. That's normal in childhood, says Kernberg. Infants do that. But then you mature, and you integrate these perceptions, and now you have a single perceptual object. So what the infant or the young child has is a good mother and a bad mother, right? You've all heard that. What's the good mother? That's the mother when she's nurturing and kind and caring. And the bad mother is when she's frustrating and deprived and mean, as though they're two individual separate beings. And eventually you learn it's the same person, and you have a more nuanced view of your mother. Sure. Okay. If you don't develop this, then you end up with a borderline structure. I'm simplifying it, but I'm not wrong. Okay. What the research suggests is you don't mature out of it. Unconsciously, you continue to categorize experiences based on emotion. Now, you might get more nuanced in your emotion, but this is what's happening. Now, let me demonstrate it to you in a way. How many of you have ever, in a political argument, convinced the other person through your rational argument that you were right and they were wrong? How many of you have been convinced? You say, oh, now that you make this point, I realize that you are correct, and I will change my political view. One person. It doesn't happen a lot. What does happen? Think of your subjective experience. You get aggravated. That's what happens. The person says to you, no, this, that, and the other. You go, what an idiot. And what are they thinking? What an idiot. And you're both idiots. Now, my colleague Drew Weston did a study where he put people in an fMRI and he presented an argument counter to their political beliefs. What part of the brain do you think bumped up? The emotional part of the brain. Then, the thinking part of the brain, in order to provide the argument to justify the emotion, which is what we all do if we really think about it. So what I'm saying is, this never goes away. We organize our experiences emotionally. That never changes. We have an explicit system now that we can use. It's there, and it's good, and it helps us. But the implicit system is also there and never goes away. You lose your temper, you know, go and speak logic all you want. You know, I'm a parent, and I know I'm supposed to be patient with my children, and I'm patient with my children until I'm not. And then I yell at them, right? And when I'm yelling at them, I'm completely right to yell at them. What have they done? Look, they ruined my life. And then I feel guilty afterwards, right? Anyone who's been a parent knows this dynamic. Anyone who's been a child has seen their crazy parents do this thing. Okay? So I'm making sense, I hope. All right. This has important implications for how you listen. Oftentimes, my supervisees will say, oh, the patient went off on some tangent and is resisting, and is not really talking about the issue. And I always say, yes, she is. There is some connection. It's not a logical one. It's not a rational one. But there's something going on here. Am I making sense? So what you pay attention to are the emotional track of what they're talking about, in addition to other things. I'm not saying pay no attention to words. I am saying, though, in addition to that, focus on the affect. Okay. Automaticity. Any questions about affective primacy before I go into automaticity? Yes?
I wonder how your model frames the fact that certain people seem to have a certain defensive style, or in your, I guess for you it would be more like a certain way of evacuating certain implicit.
A certain way of what? I'm sorry?
A certain way of treating implicit material.
All right, I'm going to answer you two ways. One is, I do believe in defenses, and I do believe in defensive styles. I'm presenting something that most clinicians, I believe, haven't heard yet, so I'm focusing on that. So I'm not going to dismiss that people have defenses and they use denial and they project. They do these things. What I'm also saying is it's not always that. Often it is a normal process that reflects what their lives were like. And you learn, and we do that. That's why we take history. That's why we find out what people did yesterday. We learn what their natural connections are. But it doesn't have to be a dynamic unconscious, although sometimes it is. It can also be this normative stuff going on. Now, one of the tasks is, which is it? And you've got to, doing clinical work isn't easy. So, you've got to figure it. There's no test that says it's implicit versus it's dynamic versus it's self-talk or whatever term it is. So I'd have to hear a particular case. I'd run through the hypotheses in my head and, do my best. Am I addressing what you said? Go ahead.
How do you separate out normative from non-normative? It's hard for me to, not as if there's a black and white.
No, there's definitely not a black and white.
How do you
But there's no black and white when we do clinical work anyway. So I would say yet another worry to have when doing clinical work. The way I do it is I try to, my default is normative, and if that doesn't work for me, I'll go somewhere else. And every once in a while, because of my implicit learning, I go directly to defense and conflict and so on and so forth. They're not mutually exclusive, though. Defenses are learned too. You often see people say one thing and do another. I'm just saying don't immediately go to some superego conflict when you see that, or some defense when you see that. Consider that these things may be happening as well. And then as a clinician, you got to do what you got to do. There's nobody, giving you the answer. There never is. You could read the greatest, I used to be in love with Winnicott, right? I thought if only I had him when I was a child, I'd be a happy person today. And then I read a book which actually had a transcript of Winnicott working, and he was as bad as everybody. Well, he was good, but you know what I mean. He went, there's 4 pages of him talking, and I know that the patient by then is sleeping. it's, we're all flawed. So I don't have an answer. I have another complication to throw in, is really what I have. Yes?
I'm wondering, like you talked about it not being mutually exclusive, if you think about it even more, that like because of the fact that we have these two sets of processing, when we turn to the default of the easier quote-unquote processing, it may be because of defensive reasons. In other words, because we could deal with it explicitly, directly, and consciously, but that's painful or uncomfortable, we then turn to our default mode. We go into autopilot because of the
That's where I'm going. That's where the next thing is. No, you're absolutely right. Under stress, we go there. We call it regression, we call it relapse, we have spontaneous recovery. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes. You're right. As soon as life gets hard, we go to our defaults. You quit smoking until you lose your job. And of course, if you smoke, you get your job back. It doesn't work that way. Yes?
But isn't free association, wasn't, that approach a way of trying to get
Absolutely.
at this?
Absolutely. It was. And so are having people record their automatic thoughts. We have techniques. I'm just saying that free association, originally, the idea was it's going to get to some wish. And then that would be the structural, no, not the structural model, it's the other one called topographical model. And then the structural model is going to get you to the defenses. And I'm saying it's going to get you to how people organize the world first. Before we start worrying about what my wish is, and my mother was hot, and my father was in the way, or I don't like things in myself, so actually you have them. It might instead be that I learn these things. So to get off of jokes, I'll tell a true story. A patient I had tells me the story from Charlotte. The patient is a little boy, has to stand on a table. Okay? And the father says, jump. And the little boy says, I'm afraid. But I'm your father. I don't know, jump, I'll catch you. I'm afraid. Jump! All right, kid jumps, father steps out of the way, kid splats on the ground, he goes, let that be a lesson, never trust anyone. Now, does this kid have an option but to grow up to be paranoid? So, is this projection? It's not projection. It's that poor guy's life. This happened. I'm not making up the story. And you'll hear more. That one is, I wouldn't call it funny, but it's not as bad as stories of sexual abuse, rape, torture. These things happen too. So, I don't know if I addressed what you're trying to get at. You'll say yes? Automaticity. I'm talking now about something either in your head or behaviorally that goes on without you reflecting on it. It just happens. It's automatic. That's why the word is there. They can be activated automatically. Like, you automatically drive your car, but you're getting in your car, you're going to drive, but there are other processes you don't even realize are getting activated, and then they just run off on their own. You don't have to monitor them. They just happen. Okay? Simple stuff, like I mentioned, tying your shoelaces, typing, driving the car, but it goes to complicated stuff, relationship patterns. We automatically flow into things, right? We all do that. Our patients all do that. What's that about? Well, it's an adaptive mechanism. If you had to do everything with conscious thought and reflection, you'd use up resources and burn out quickly. What happens instead is when you do something often enough, it gets automated. It becomes habit. It becomes a track in your nervous system that you don't have to think about, you don't have to monitor, you don't have to use resources for. Barge literally calls it efficiency. So that makes sense, right? That would be a good thing. When I drive a car, I don't have to go 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, right foot, not left foot, step, or when I learned the stick shift, that was a fun one. Right? I can just do it now. So, and now my resources are freed up. I can talk to you in my car. I can listen to the radio. And this happens throughout life. We get to a point where we can do something, and now we have resources freed up to do other things. Great. Okay? Here's the not great part. It's mechanical now. It's reflexive now. And it's rigid and inflexible. It's very hard now to change it. It was great on the Savannah because the environment didn't change that much. Not so great on the streets of New York City, or what town are we in? Brookline? Brookville.